I think we should start by perhaps turning to that panelist who, in a way, gave rise to this whole event, and this is John Booth. So he would be the living example, the living exemplar of a lay linguist that we have here. John, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us also what was the impetus for first contacting me a few months ago or half a year ago.
Yes, thank you. So as the ad for this meeting suggests, I'm not a professional linguist in the sense of teaching or researching linguistics as an academic discipline at a known institution. I have, though, worked with languages all my professional life. So I taught it, I've translated it, occasionally I've interpreted, and I've regularly proofread and copy-edited text, both in British English and American English. But on the question of linguistics, I came to the subject quite late, however, I would say. The focus of my first degree, for instance, in German, was literary. And to the extent that if there were more additional options I could take on German literature, I would opt for them. So it wasn't until in my late 20s, I would say, that I actually got around to reading my first linguistics book, and that was the book by David Crystal by the name of Linguistics, which I'd had on my bookshelf for some time prior to that. And I was fascinated by it and by what David Crystal had to say. And so from then on, I was going around to any bookshop and picking up any book I could find. So I went through all the gamut of the Penguin literature on it, Trudgell, sociolinguistics, and blah, 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 all the classics, until I got to the point where I'd read a lot of linguistics, and I thought, well, I better see if I'm understanding this correctly. So I enrolled on a linguistics course at a nearby university to establish whether I was going in the right direction. And as it transpires, I had been. So I'm now at the stage in my linguistics career, for want of a better word, that I've had a small number of papers published in a variety of journals based on my own research working from home. And I'm what Professor Kortmann would describe as a lay linguistic the epitome thereof, I would maintain. So I'm also retired now, and I'm no longer engaged in gainful employment. So that's a little bit about my background. But I want to now talk about what I'm doing here today, really. And that's best explained by a personal story. So you'll forgive me if I read parts out because there are some quotations involved in it. So it was in 2023 that I submitted a paper to a journal of which Professor Kortmann is the editor. And though the paper was rejected on the basis that it had nothing new to offer, nothing to argue there, it wasn't particularly, it wasn't an earth-shattering tome I produced or anything, but there was approval of it on the sole point, that's a quotation, that I had made a justifiable criticism of purely corpus-based studies with this statement. I'm now going to have to read this out. This makes one wonder where academic research is heading if providing detailed analyses of linguistic corpora, instead of simply switching on the TV or radio and apprehending with one's own ears, should turn out to be the lesser alternative when it comes to assessing the state of a language. Put simply, if the B and C used by the authors were to still reveal the use of the stated progressive to be so limited today, using the same form of sampling as that for 1994 to 2014, then it cannot be looking in the right place. So that bold statement was welcome. Now, excuse me, because of my condemnation here was a claim made in the 2019 paper by two authors, and I'll quote this again in full. we're talking about the stated progressive as appearing in expressions such as I am loving and so on. So this is the quotation. The present data show that, that progressive use of love has increased from 0 instances in 1994, before the McDonald's slogan, to 0.92% of all instances of love in 2014. And that the 9 instances come from 8 different speakers in 9 different texts. So from 0 to 9, based on the input from, based on 9 instances from 8 different speakers. So since at the time of writing, I'd already collected a substantial amount of evidence on a number of instances from various speakers in a variety of contexts without really trying, simply noted them as I encountered them, almost an haphazard fashion, really. I was amazed by this finding. So just if you bear that point in mind, a second point I'd like to make is linked to this is the experience I had at the peer review stage for the same paper when it was later accepted elsewhere. And in my view, the comments are illustrative of how the corpus-based approach has become so dominant within linguistic research that it's now the default position. One reviewer wrote, and again I quote, "The call for what is referred to as real-world exemplification as opposed to corpus linguistic statistical analyses does not appear timely." That I emphasize those words they use. And they continued, "Although it is understood that corpus linguistic studies should be received critically, this argument in favor of real-world exemplification is," and again, this is my emphasis, "at odds with advances in the empirical description of language." Similarly, though perhaps more worryingly, because of its prejudicial overtones, was I think it was the second reviewer that said this. So the comment was, "The author's experiences of hearing numerous instances of stative verbs in the progressive sounds like it may be the frequency illusion, also known as Biedermannhof phenomenon, which should be acknowledged instead of criticizing," my emphasis again, "the quality of corpora." So here we've got a position where not only was the what for me quite favorable method I'd chosen being poo-pooed, but furthermore, the alternative method was being prescribed as the optimal method I should have been following. Really. As I say, I argued my case and the paper was accepted, but I had to sort of go through hoops to get to that point, I think. And finally, which is, I think, relevant to the point I'm trying to make, I was introduced to a book from 2007 written by the British philosopher Miranda Fricker, and its title was Epistemic Injustice. And I got into this through something quite different. It wasn't linguistic related, but Fricker argues in the book that the unwillingness of a listener or a reader in the present case to accept the testimony of a speaker or writer, which may result in belittlement or loss of credibility, is an instance of what she calls testimonial injustice. She subsequently goes on to define this more narrowly as a distinctively epistemic injustice. This is a quote now. "A kind of injustice in which someone is wrong specifically in her capacity as knower," and there the emphasis is Fricker's. And while she roots this in identity prejudice, clearly this sort of behavior whereby the testimony of a contributor is denied to a certain extent as import for the non-acceptance of non-dominant methodologies in the field of linguistics, I would maintain. Now, added to this is this feeling of exclusion or disenfranchisement from the system, is the fact that that statistical reporting is, for me personally, made difficult for the likes of myself as a lay linguist, because I've never been attached to an institution, and consequently I'm excluded from ready access to corporate in the first place. In fact, the majority of sites I've tried to access are corporate-based, corporate-driven sites, have usually required me to enter the name of an institution, and consequently I don't really get in. And it hasn't helped me personally either. The local university where I graduated in linguistics closed its humanities department a number of years ago. So I can't even get down to look through the library stock and try and glean evidence from that. I'm not complaining here, I would say. I'm mainly trying to explain, I think, how increasingly disenfranchised I feel as someone attempting to produce hopefully meaningful linguistic analyses on the strength of their own observations. And in the face of a seemingly taken for granted view, and I can't stress that term more strongly, that statistical reporting is the only way to proceed. And incidentally, as to back up the point I'm trying to make, I read a paper by Larson, Egbert, and Bieber written in 2022, which was called On the Status of Statistical Reporting versus Linguistic Description in Corpus Linguistics. And they were of the opinion that, well, they showed, in fact, how quickly corpus linguistics has become the de facto modus operandi for linguists. And they tried to change in the methodological approach from a preference for linguistic description stroke interpreting over statistical reporting in 2009 to the complete opposite position in 2019. And they further point out that while the description method requires a human analyst with linguistics training, the findings of statistical reporting could be summarized by any statistician or someone with quantitative statistical training. So in other words, a non-linguist. I've gone. Why have I gone? Why have I disappeared?
No, you're still there.
Sorry. My screen blanked. I should keep moving my mouse around. Beg your pardon. Yeah, and the final point they made, I think, was that increased methodological sophistication isn't necessarily a positive development, but rather it appears to some extent to have come at the expense of linguistic analysis involving linguistic examples and text experts, and thereby it's moved away from its primary focus in linguistics, namely language as the object of study. So in conclusion, I mean, what can I say about my own method? What I call observation and collection is, I like to think of it as a kind of initial input in the analysis process. So I make an observation and hope that it resonates enough with readers to make them want to either prove or disprove any generalizations I might have made, as would happen with any scientific hypothesis, I would say. And I don't see it at that particular stage to make a definitive 100% verifiable statement, if there is such a thing, but rather I'm merely going where the evidence seems to lead, and I would argue that that's a permissible road to take. So, I mean, I'll leave it there, if I may. I don't think there's anything much more to say other than perhaps that quantification isn't by any means ruled out by the observation collection method. It perhaps just like the serious numbers to substantiate the claim you might want to make.
Yeah, thank you, John. So I mean, I think everyone has now perhaps understands better where we came from with this with this particular event, because John and I entered in a very interesting discussion. He also wrote a very nice short paper discussing exactly this sort of the problems perhaps of this kind of mainstream linguistics in a very nice and essay-like way. It's only when we continued our communication via email that we always thought, what's the best way of bringing this to the public? What's the best arena to negotiate exactly the kinds of concerns that observations, experiences, and concerns that someone like John has. And at some point I thought, well, maybe the IL Online forum is one such arena. Okay, so where we can really start a conversation. So here we have the lay linguist's view. We have two colleagues who said, well, this is really an interesting question, and we would also like to contribute to it. And these two are Elizabeth Hanks, and Elizabeth, I think, granted me or maybe us to say Lizzie. Is that all right? So just as you say in your name there, and Axel Bohmann. And let me just briefly introduce Lizzie first. So she graduated with a PhD in applied linguistics from Northern Arizona University in May. So it's not too long ago. I think I still remember the previous month. And she will start as an assistant professor at the University of South Florida in August. Okay. And she's already sort of joining us from Florida. She uses corpus methods in order to research conversation, pragmatics, and vocabulary. And she's currently working on compiling the Lancaster, Northern Arizona corpus of American spoken English with a team of researchers from Lancaster, UK, and Northern Arizona University. Two books are forthcoming under contract, and one of them is on linguistic variation across conversational discourse types. And maybe I leave it at that. And Lizzie, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the introduction. And thanks for having me today. Let me share my screen very quickly. If you can't see this, please let me know. My thoughts today surround this idea of personal experiences. And for me, as a linguist, lots of my own research, my research questions and the lines of inquiry that I'm most interested in stem from my own experience. And I think that many of us as linguists, I would venture a guess that we all use these same methods. We draw from our experiences to formulate our research questions. And so I wonder then, as individuals, we can only have so many experiences of our own. And as linguists, we also have many shared experiences because we all have similar training. And so I wonder how much more impactful our research can be if then we listened to and we responded to personal experiences from a broader population. And so that's where my brief talk today comes from. I first started thinking about this question in compiling Lana case, this corpus that was just mentioned. And we're in the process of getting it ready to be released right now, but this is a corpus that will be about 10 million words of spoken conversation collected from all across the United States. And when we first started collecting data and recruiting for this project, we asked participants to submit conversations. And so here's a screenshot from some of the instructions on our website. It's pretty bare bones. We say upload, record a conversation and then submit your conversation recording without any explanation of actually what is a conversation. And it was really interesting then to receive a lot of sort of questions about what could constitute conversation. And these are things that I had not considered before. So some examples here, some participants, potential participants were wondering whether service encounters, for example, at a restaurant could be included. How about interviews or live streaming on social media, maybe recordings from classes that someone's teaching, possibly this one on the right here about having a conversation with a toddler when maybe the toddler doesn't fully understand you and you don't fully understand the toddler, but would that still be considered a conversation? Or even talking to a dog or talking to yourself? So these are all questions that I personally hadn't considered before, but thanks to these non-linguists who asked these questions, I started asking them as well. Our team did. And looking at the literature, actually, it became clear too that linguists, even linguists who focus on conversation and study conversation, don't study a consistent operationalization of conversation. We operationalize it differently. And this is something that I never would have looked into if it weren't for non-linguists bringing it up. And this question actually became a large part of my dissertation, which is all about quantitatively describing the domain or the register of conversation. So actually trying to operationalize it. Before I started this study, if you had asked me to sort of map out the domain of conversation from what's the most conversation-y thing, the most central to conversation, and what's on the outskirts of conversation, I would have done maybe something like this with, for example, having lunch with friends to be the most conversation-like interaction I could have. It's most central to conversation. And then probably the most peripheral, I would say maybe text messaging is the most peripheral. This is on the outskirts of what conversation could entail. And some of you might not agree with me. You might have different ideas about this too. But after collecting survey data from 900 participants, many of whom were not trained in linguistics, as well as conducting interviews, I was able to sort of map out what these people thought. And we can see it looks very different from what I had initially imagined based on my own experience and I'll put this in quotes, my expertise with conversation. Turns out members of the general public have many different views about what conversation is. And there's quantitative evidence to support this. I'll show you the numbers here. 7 means that this interaction was deemed sort of the most conversational. This is the epitome of conversation, and then it goes down from there. So we can see that participants believed, just like I had imagined, that lunch with friends would be the most conversation-y interaction. But the next item here is text messages. And we can see actually the difference quantitatively between these two is not that big. It's a difference of 6.1 down to 5.8. So non-linguists perceive text messages to be almost as conversation-like as sitting down and chatting with your friends while you're having lunch. And so I think this is an example of how we can gain a lot of valuable insight from people who maybe don't have a formal training in linguistics. And the last thing I'll say too is through these experiences, collecting data for the corpus, and then also collecting data and working on this project, I've seen, it seems to me that members of the general public are really interested in being involved in this type of work. They really care about language and they want to share their insights. Here's some examples, some screenshots from social media showing how excited and interested people are in linguistics. And so I think that even though language and linguistics, it might not be everyone's career, everyone uses language on a daily basis, and it's important to our daily lives. And I think in that way, it makes everyone who uses language an expert to some extent. And that's it for me.
Well, thank you, Lizzie. So you gave us an example how the responses by your some 900 informants really sort of also, well, perhaps did not change your views of what is a prototypical conversation. It was a peripheral conversation, but at least you could actually represent the way it is perceived in the public. Okay, so you learned something, you gained something from having involved not really lay linguists, but the native speakers. And they were probably for the first time asked this kind of question, what they perceive to be a conversation. Would you imagine that in all walks of linguistic life, the voice of the native speaker could be helpful, or would you rather think, well, that there may be some areas where this is helpful, but other areas where this may be less the case?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So I think in this case, conversation is something that we all use. We all engage in conversation. So it seems a very natural fit to sort of rely on native speaker, and not just native speaker intuitions, but intuitions from people who use this type of language conversation on a daily basis. So I think for each research question, we would have to think, as usual, we have to think about sort of our population, who we're actually trying to learn about. But I think we should also think about the stakeholders. So who benefits from this research? And I think in that way we can involve both the population, which is something that we already do in linguistics, but also involve the stakeholders, which again, that's something we always do, but maybe to a lesser extent. And for applied linguistics, we might want to involve stakeholders a little bit more.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. This was specifically also from an applied linguistic perspective.
Mm.
There is yet another perspective, I guess, probably from a perhaps corpus-based or quantitative or world English's perspective that Axel will come. Axel Bohmann is full professor of English linguistics at the University of Cologne. Before he moved to Cologne last year, he was an assistant professor at the University of Freiburg. And before that, he spent 7 years at University of Texas in Austin, where he did his, among other things, his PhD. And as I said, world Englishes, corpus linguistics, language variation and change, sociolinguistics of globalization, these are sort of things that he has worked a lot, and one book that has been accepted for publication and will come out, I guess, later this or next year. He will have to say this.
Expecting this year.
Okay, is English among West African migrants in Germany, a reflexive approach. And well, reflect is exactly what we want to do here. And this is another invitation for reflection, Axel.
Thank you very much, Bernd. Thanks for inviting me. I think you maybe framed me slightly out of touch with what I'm going to say. I mean, you kind of introduced me as a corpus linguist, and I fully identify as that. But I'm going to be pretty critical, sort of responding also to John's experience about what we do with corpora and a lot of the research in world Englishes, especially. So I want to talk about that and also pick up sort of Lizzie's idea that basically everybody is a lay linguist, right? Everybody is an expert on language to some extent, and also the question of how the stakeholders are engaged. And I think in world Englishes, that's a particularly pertinent question. So I'm going to start with sort of the story of my second book project, right? The book that you just mentioned. Started out as a project looking at sort of language use among West African immigrants in southwestern Germany, and had the initial interest, a very descriptive sort of interest, third wave sociolinguistics, but still linguistic description, what sort of features from what varieties, with a lot of different varieties potentially contributing are used and how are they used, etc. And then in the process of doing field research, I found out that participants had a lot of opinions and ideas about language, and particularly ideas that were wildly out of line with what my descriptive knowledge and evidence suggested, right? Things like, what does it mean to speak Pidgin? How do people talk about their competence in German and English, etc. Just statements where, from my perspective initially, I had to say, okay, this is clearly descriptively wrong, right? And I want to kind of start at that disjunction, right? What do we do when that happens? What do we do when there's certain things we have found out, we have evidence for as linguists, but the public or the people we engage in just believe something radically different? And then one option, and I would argue that's sort of the default option, and the one that John also encountered, is we explain to people how their perceptions are wrong, right? How linguistic reality, as we have empirical evidence for in the form of corpora, amongst other things, increasingly sort of very canonically in the form of corpora, suggest a certain thing and other ideas are sort of wrong, right? And there's a long tradition of doing that. This whole notion of prescriptivism versus descriptivism, which is a marked pair of differences, right? Prescriptivism bad, descriptivism good, and descriptivism is what we as linguists have privileged access to, books on language myths, etc. Which, by the way, I'm not criticizing that book in general at all. Bauer and Trotgill, I really think it's a really good book. but it sort of it speaks a certain perspective where you know, we have an idea that there is an objective, non-ideological way of looking at language, and we as empirical linguists, we have privileged access to this perspective, and other people who have strong beliefs about language, we're very sort of skeptical of, or very hesitant to engage their perspectives seriously, and very often kind of treat them as a nuisance a little bit, right? And in doing that, we obviously we assume a strongly normative position. We kind of make claims to knowledge. That's right. We're a discipline. We need to justify our existence as a discipline, and we do that by making a claim to particularly privileged knowledge about language. But this can be really problematic if the claim rests on shaky ground, and particularly, I think, if we, the researchers, are complete outsiders to a speech community that we're describing, and we're not engaging stakeholders in the speech community. And that's obviously the case in World English quite a bit. We have a lot of researchers from Germany and Austria, somewhere else in the world as well, but it's strongly centered in Germany, particularly, that, you know, take corpus evidence from corpora representing different varieties of English, and then make pretty sweeping statements about these varieties, right? And in my experience, very rarely is there a check against sort of perceptions of speakers of those varieties, or any attempt to bring these stakeholders into the conversation, right? And there's the question then is really, right, is corpus linguistics bad in its as a matter of principle? And it certainly isn't, right? But if you think about the leaps that are made, right, we sort of say things about the relation, the you know, normative development of Hong Kong English based on a couple of conditioning factors of the genitive alternation, and how they relate to how the genitive alternation is conditioned in British and American English, right? The question, I think, is very, the question begs itself whether that has any meaning for the speakers, right? Whether that tells us anything about normativity in those communities, right? And that sort of notion, somebody like John entering the conversation and saying, okay, I read your paper, there's corpus evidence here, but this clearly is not my experience. This is something that definitely needs to be taken seriously, and that should be really, really valued, right? I mean, this is, if nothing else, it's kind of a corrective, a level of checks and balances that we should be a lot more open to. And ideally, we shouldn't just sort of be open to it. We should be inviting that, and not sort of guarding ourselves off from those perspectives by arguing, you know, the p-value that I've created based on this corpus sort of is the discussion ending piece of evidence here. And I'm just going to leave it here because time is sort of flying, and we want to discuss, right?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Axel. I think I outlined at the beginning what our sort of plan for the procedure in this event is. I think since we are really among ourselves here in a nice group, we should immediately move into the public discussion here, so that I will not sort of, I can start one or two initial questions, but if there are already immediate questions or comments that you have, then do not hesitate.